Good evening to the École des Modernités. Bonsoir. Before we start tonight, I'd like to say a personal word. It's been 7 years I've run the École des Modernités research program. It's been both a pleasure and an honor to work for the Giacometti Foundation on the invitation of Catherine Grenier. Tonight will be the last lecture that I will animate myself. Of course, the program will continue, it will go on, and I would like to thank the colleagues who are in the room here, or maybe online too, who will animate the forthcoming lectures that are in the programs. I also see a lecturer in the room. Thank you for being here. Thank you for all those years. The contribution you gave to the program, whether talking at the desk, following online or asking questions, writing books, contributing to research days, or just asking questions to keep the conversation going. Of course, it's a bit moving for me after all those years to leave the foundation, but that's for other adventures. And I do wish the best for the École des Modernités, the Giacometti Foundation, which has great projects, and for all the discussions that animated us on rewriting, rethinking the history of modern art more globally with new questions, new matters, such as the one that will be discussed tonight. It's also my great pleasure to welcome for this lecture Dawn Ades, who is sitting just next to me. Dawn, of course, you know the great contribution she gave to the study of surrealism, of course, first and foremost. Dawn Ades is a professor emerita of the history of art at the University of Essex. She's professor of art history at the Royal Academy and a former trustee of Tate between 1995 and 2005, as well as the National Gallery between 2000 and 2005. She's also a member of the British Academy and the Association of Art Historians. Though we know Dawn's field is surrealism, she also pioneered the study of Latin American art and a research that primarily focused on Dada and surrealism. I think you all have both the exhibition in the book that derived or accompanied it in mind, and the grey cover of that thick catalogue. She has more recent development in the study of women artists, and that will be the focus of tonight's lecture. This made it possible to align these areas of interest, surrealism, Dadaism, Latin American art, with publications of on Leonora Carrington, Maria Izquierdo, Mina Loy, and Ofelia Rodriguez, among others. Among the numerous exhibitions she co-created and curated with accompanied catalogues, I would just mention a few, but the foremost ones. Dada and Surrealism Reviewed, that was the publication I mentioned, which dates from 1978, and actually Dawn shared with me a document that dated from that year at BBC, a comment on Supo and Zara's contribution discussion with Oliver Todd at the BBC. Another exhibition and catalogue is Art in Latin America, the Modern Era, 1820-1980. Then Dali's Optical Illusions, and following this venue, Dali Duchamp, organized at the Royal Academy in London in 2017-18. Tonight's lecture will be devoted to mainly, but not only, 3 women artists associated with surrealism. It's called Women Artists, Surrealism and the Challenge of Eco-Feminism, and I'm most curious about the combination of those artists towards this notion, and I think it will be fascinating. And the 3 artists quoted are Ithell Colquhoun, Leonora, Carrington, and Valentine Penrose. Again, thank you very much, Dawn, for accepting this lecture, for giving it here in Paris. We had many discussions about the whereabouts and how the history that you will talk about tonight is related to the neighborhood that we're in. And, well, I should not last too long. I have talked too much. Thank you very much. The floor is yours.
thank you so much, Hugo, for that introduction. And I'm very honored to be speaking here. This is a wonderful institution, and it's very exciting for me to talk to you tonight. I apologize profusely for speaking in English, because I really could have done it in French, but it's easier for me, so there we are. But I do hope you can hear me all right, and put up your hand if at any point you feel you're not actually following what I'm saying. Okay. So the artists I've chosen to talk about, almost but not quite by random, by chance, are Leonora Carrington, Ithell Colquhoun, and Valentine Penrose. And they each had different relationships to the surrealist movement and to what are now called eco-feminist ideas. Now, I have to admit, this is a relatively new area, in fact, a very new area for me, and it's very speculative what I'm saying about the way I'm deploying what I think are some of those ideas in relation to the work of the artists. So you'll have to forgive me if some of it is problematic. You may well have criticism of it, so I expect that, okay? The artists are not intended as case studies in any sense, and they were not a group. Each had a strong identity of their own, and they were all as much writers. They were also writers, all of them. And in the case of Penrose, of course, a great poet, as visual artists. Now, the term, so you can just see, I've just chosen a few photographs to introduce you to them as characters. The term ecofeminism was coined by the French feminist Françoise d'Aubonne in 1974. It links feminist and ecological concerns, arguing a direct connection between the exploitation of nature and natural resources and the oppression of women under patriarchal capitalist systems. The devaluation or continued non-valuation of women equates with the devaluation of the environment in a profit-based system of exploitation, extraction and drilling, for example, which means that the Earth is heading fast to a disastrous collapse. And you don't have to be a woman, by the way, to be an eco-feminist, I don't think. Now, it seems to me that there are parallels with Leonora Carrington's Manifesto for the Feminist Movement in Mexico in 1970. It's a wonderful text called What is a Woman? Now, the first part is about what is a woman, and it's very funny, but I'm not talking about that. I'm talking more about the manifesto in relation to ecofeminism. And she writes, "Since civilization is rolling towards absolute destruction for Earth, the last hope is an act of will to step out of the mechanical trap and refuse. If all the women of the world decide to control the population, to refuse war, to refuse discrimination of sex or race, and thus force men to allow life to survive on this planet, that would be a miracle indeed. The idea," she went on, "that our masters are right and must be loved, honored, and obeyed is, I think, one of the most destructive lies that have been instilled into the female psyche. It has become horribly obvious that what these masters have done to our planet and her organic life. If women remain passive, I think there is very little hope for the survival of life on this earth." And that was 1970. That's really interesting. A little bit more hopeful in 1977, not about the world, actually about women. She said, "Comme femmes, nous avons été discriminées. Et maintenant, la réaction me paraît merveilleuse. On a commencé à questionner pourquoi était-on considérés comme des êtres inférieurs." Now, Hugo encouraged me to address things from an historiographic point of view. So a brief look at the problem in surrealism of the overvaluation of woman with a capital W at the expense of the undervaluation of women with a lowercase w. And of course, very famously, La Révolution surréaliste began with this photo collage of the group of male surrealists surrounding, in this case, a real woman. This was Germaine Berton, who had killed the right-wing leader of the Camelot du Roi. And they liked that, and so she is there at the center. And there's a deliberate echo of that in the final issue. That was 1924. The final issue in 1929 of La Révolution surrealiste, where she is much more woman with a capital W. Je ne vois pas la femme cachée dans la forêt. Now, the position is a bit more complicated in terms of gender, actually, because the surrealists didn't relate to any existing or theoretical social or gender ideas about women, and they specifically rejected patriarchal ideals, nationalism, and militarism. They hated père, patron, patrie, and the gender roles that went with them. So the surrealists held that women should be free, but basically free of the kitchen and the nursery. But they regarded the political struggle for the emancipation of women as a sort of bourgeois conceit, in the same way that the Communist Party did. So I'm often been asked, why have so many women actually taken to surrealism, historians and critics as well as artists, when that was the position? So perhaps it was something to do with the idea of freedom. But there are interesting aspects of this which we could perhaps talk about later. But of course, there she is, the headless woman. And in a way, as these images indicate, women were basically objects of desire and potentially the mysterious creative force, the muse, which I'm always very skeptical about. But there we are, the idea of being a muse, whether they liked the idea of being a muse, one we should ask about. When I once, back in the 1970s, I complained to a friend of mine, who's a rather senior male surrealist, about their attitude to women. And he said, I don't know what you're talking about. We loved women. And yes, it was quite difficult to get any idea across there might be a problem there. And I will also quote something that Ithell Colquhoun wrote about this, because I'd raised the issue with her. And she said, I quote, Breton said somewhere, and I quote from memory, que la femme soit libre et adorée. But I'm sorry to say that, as her essay implies, that was my essay, most of Breton's followers were no less chauvinist for that. Among them, women, as human beings, tended to be permitted, not required. So, as is often pointed out, the surrealists, possibly unconsciously, presented themselves as a male club. And the male bond, this is a sort of different area, but it's really interesting. The male bond was very, very strong. They were malique, as Duchamp would say. And Xavier Gauthier, I put up 3 important publications in this area. Xavier Gauthier's Surrealism et Sexualité was really the first, 1971, that was, 1971, was the first serious challenge to the movement's own account of gender relations. And it was met with absolute outrage, I can remember. She pointed out the fury with which any discussion of male homosexuality was rejected. She suggested, interestingly, that in surrealist poetry by men, woman is good and loved, and in painting, on the whole, bad and hated. Certainly the woman as threat, as praying mantis, as femme fatale, is as common in the paintings as the peaceful images of woman in relation to flowers and nature and nice things. So was it in response to Xavier's book that a new strand of surrealist studies focusing on women surrealists emerged? I mean, it's possible, the other 2 we're looking at here. But before that, there was a really low point in the recognition of the importance of women in surrealism. That low point, in my view, was William Rubin's exhibition, Dada, Surrealism and Their Heritage, at the Museum of Modern Art in New York in 1968. at the same time, there was a large book called Dada and Surrealist Art, which was slightly different, actually. But in the exhibition, as far as I could see, 1968, there were only 4 women. Hannah Hoch, Merit Oppenheim, Nikita Samphal, and Sophie Teuber-Arp, which is actually quite extraordinary, given how many women we're now aware of that were linked to the movement, very, very active in it too, not just after the war, but also before the war. Oblique, La Femme Surrealiste, had 36 women in it, all actually presented by men, which is quite interesting. There was still a sense that they had to be presented. They couldn't speak for themselves, which is quite interesting. And in relation to this cover, I keep getting intrusions from artificial intelligence, from AI, suggesting titles. And their title for this one was A Book Cover with a Bird Flying Over. So I'm glad to say they actually can't recognize metaphor. Not yet. We'll see. The women presented in La Femme Surrealiste included Carrington, Valentine Penrose, Oppenheim and Finney, but not Colquhoun. And then Whitney Chadwick's very seminal book, of course, Women Artists and the Surrealist Movement, lacked, 1985, lacked 3 women. Merit Oppenheim refused because she didn't agree with the argument at all. And Tanning and Feeney also didn't want to be part of a sort of feminist sort of grouping. So just those 3 were not in it. So this is an example of La Femme Surrealiste, Leonora Carrington and Valentine Penrose, both in it, and both introduced. The text is by, on the left, it's by Max Ernst, and on the right, it's by Georges Bataille, which I'll come on to in a moment. Now, so the term ecofeminism, I encountered it, I'm afraid, perhaps earlier, but certainly really noticed it for the first time in the Colquhoun catalogue, the catalogue for the current or just finished Colquhoun exhibition at Tate. An essay in the catalogue by Nora Bowman and Astrida Niemanis. I'm going to be talking about the painting on the right, Tree Anatomy of 1942. The title of the essay was Whole Play and Clitoral Beacons, Eco-Feminist Superabundance. And it's a terrifically punchy text, well worth reading. I was very struck by it. And I found it, I'm afraid I don't know how acceptable to the proper theorists of ecofeminism this is. That I don't know. I'd like to hear any views about that. But I found it extremely enlightening about Ithell's work. And the essay opens with an argument that picks it up immediately on Carrington's 1970 Manifesto for Women. And they write in the catalogue, forest fires, floods, droughts and storms go by the name of climate change. But these disasters and the land grabs, wars and genocide that are both their cause and effect are better understood as symptoms of heteropatriarchal and colonial dominance. So ecofeminism has made very important connections between the violence done to women's bodies and the violence done to the land. But while some see a way of resisting that violence by embracing nature as a site of feminist fecundity, others are afraid of biological essentialism. The writers on Colquhoun grasp the nettle of the old saying, woman is to nature as man is to culture, by arguing that Colquhoun turns the nature trope into an active, vital force, rather than the passive and submissive horizontality of most woman-nature equations. So I quote them. Colquhoun figures lands, waters, and bodies as mazes of entries and supersized flesh, with holes that swallow you up if you come too close. I think that's exactly what this one does. tree anatomy. In tree anatomy, the vaginal gap in the tree trunk emerges from deep green thighs as if the tree phallus has yawned, revealing soft pink lips and hairs waving slightly like a sea anemone. Guess what AI, artificial intelligence, said it was? Is it was a picture of a baby in a cave. Very sort of wonderful. And in Stalactite, 1962, she stretches and exploits the visual metaphors with uncanny brilliance, here overwhelming the viewer with gaps, holes, and arches to balance and exaggerate the columnar stalactite. It's a very striking one to actually confront physically. It's really very interesting. And finally, Scylla, this great painting, Scylla, which belonged to the Tate. I mean, they bought it quite early. And we included it in the exhibition, Dada and Surrealism Reviewed, in 1978. And I wrote about it in an essay for the Oxford Art Journal in 1980. It was called Notes on Two Women Surrealist Painters, Eileen Agar and Ithell Colquhoun. And I described the painting then as an explicit challenge to forms of sexual imagery exploited by the surrealists, which, for example, treat landscape metaphorically as a woman, as in this drawing by André Masson, erotic landscape. I mean, you know, there it is. It's all there for you. That particular drawing, woman to be entered as the landscape exploited. She offers, I argued, a reciprocally male landscape. I had read the rock legs of Scylla. Scylla, of course, is the six-headed man-eating monster, threatening sailors from the cliffs opposite the whirlpool of Charybdis, the famous danger that sailors had to sail through. I described them as phallic. This surprised Colquhoun, who wrote to me via the journal in response. And I quote from her letter. Scylla, in my view, is primarily a feminine symbol, but I suppose one could see it as phallic as well. It's very interesting. So whether she sort of wasn't aware, I don't know. It's a thought, but she accepted it in a way that it could be both. And I think we can see it now as this very, wonderful way it confuses gender binaries into new combinations. It's got the sort of ruffled male legs. It's also a watery female with its tuft of seaweed and the sea slit with approaching boat. And the legs grow into giant, desiring, rocky malic legs, is how I described it. It's very interesting, actually. I don't know the answer to this, but it was painted the same year as Frida Kahlo's What the Water Yields to Me, which was on show in Paris in 1938. And I think almost certainly Colquhoun saw it. And so Scylla is also in a curious way a response to this rather feminine exploration of identity, giving it a much greater sort of potential masculinity. I think it's quite interesting thought about anyway. Just to show it, it's the idea of looking at your legs in the water and imagining things is a very very interesting one. So bodies loom as large as lands themselves in La Cathédrale Engloutie, 1952. The island home of the ritual stone circles is a knee, woman taking over and inhabiting the earth, forming an unbroken link to the ancient submerged beliefs which you see in those ritual circles. Now, Colquhoun actually attributed her deployment of the visual metaphor to Salvador Dali's critical paranoiac double images. However, I actually think there's a real difference between them, but I'd be interested to know what you think. I see in Gouffre Amer, for example, which is a male torso, like the body described in The Tempest as being underwater and having turned to coral and seashells and so on, is actually sort of both body and seashells. The body is also the coral, and the sea creatures it has become. And I think there's a difference, you see, though this may not be the best example. Dali's apparition of face and fruit dish on a beach, 1938. For Dali, and you can see in the corner, bottom left-hand corner there's the famous duck rabbit, of the psychologists, which you either see as a rabbit or you see as a duck. You don't see it as both simultaneously. And Dalia's idea always was that you see either, as it were, in this case, the fruit dish, or you see the forehead of the face. Either you see the dog with its collar, or you see a bridge. I mean, one could go on discussing this, but I really do think there's a difference. I mean, it's very, nice of her to credit Dalia. I think she's doing something actually quite different and very interesting in her own right in that way. Now, Colquhoun's probably the most loyal follower of the surrealist principle of automatism, which she proselytized as widely as possible. I'll just briefly say something about her relationship with surrealism, which is quite interesting. It was very unlike Leonora Carrington's. Colquhoun was an official member, in her own right, as a professional painter and writer, of the London group, centred on the London Gallery and the London Bulletin in the late 1930s. However, she was expelled or worked out, accounts slightly vary, in 1940, when the Belgian surrealist and gallerist E.L.T. Messens took over the group and tried to weld the group into an exclusive unit. This meant renouncing membership of any other organisation. You would only be a surrealist, nothing else. This meant for curtains for Colquhoun, basically. She was not prepared to give up her affiliations with occult groups. She belonged to several. And she always hoped to be admitted to the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, which I'm afraid she never was. She, for various reasons, she didn't quite come up to their idea. And but in many ways, she remained, although isolated, faithful to the ideas to the ideas of surrealism. Very faithful, particularly to automatism, which she saw as an experimental form of expression. And here she is this one, yes. Here she is demonstrating on BBC TV in 1948 how to make automatic paintings and drawings. In this case, it's the sort of alternative automatic techniques of fumage, that's using smoke to make patterns, and parsemage, which is sprinkling dust on a surface and then spreading, and then covering with sheets of paper and drawing it off. And she experimented a lot with decalcomania. She calls this decalcomania, but I think it's probably a mixture of decalcomania. Decalcomania is when you spread or pour paint on a surface and then press another sheet of paper on it and peel it off. And it does form the most extraordinary sort of landscapes. Decalcomania is a really wonderful, wonderful thing. She here, I think, also presses the paper itself together, but she then develops it. She then sees into it, sees things in it. In 1949, she published a very important text about automatism called Children of the Mantic Stain, where she acknowledges the origins of automatism in the definition of surrealism in the first manifesto, pure psychic automatism, that invests it with the powers of alchemical clairvoyance. The automatic stains, she says, have a mantic or divinatory power. The magical projections into the apparently chance marks, the imaginative interpretations, have, she suggests, an august ancestry in their link to alchemy and to the mysteries of the unconscious. This particular decalcomania she developed twice, once into a gorgon on the left, and she found that so frightening that she also developed it into the guardian angel as an alternative. She was sort of trying, I think, to cancel the power of the gorgon and turn it into a guardian angel. It's a very beautiful one on the right. But you can see how she develops imaginatively the original decalcomania. Extraordinary painting, which is the last one I'll look at of Colquhoun's, called Attributes of the Moon, 1947. I've tried to show what the surface is like because it really is quite congealed and it's doing something different from the sort of classic decalcomania. In one of her essays, she quotes the 17th century alchemical treatise by Irenaeus Philalethes on gazing into the contents of the glass vessel, the alembic. The reign of the moon lasts just 3 weeks, but before it closes, the substance exhibits a great variety of forms. It will become liquid and again coagulate 100 times a day. Whenever you look at it, you will have cause for astonishment. And perhaps in this painting, there's also a memory of a dream she recounted in a little text called The Order of the Sun and Moon, Nicaragua. She never knew why it was Nicaragua. This is a dream of a grotto, and inside the arch rises a mass of dark, porous substance like pumice stone, with holes through which the light of the sun and the moon shine. And of course, in alchemy, the moon is the feminine principle, associated with water, the soul, and whitening or purifying. This is very important to Colquhoun. She was a great believer in the occult and in alchemy. So there's so much more to say about her, I'm sorry, but I want to get on to Carrington and Leonora. Carrington, whose relationship with surrealism, I'm treating each artist actually quite separately. I think that's the simplest way of going about it, rather than trying to draw threads between them, because actually their relationships with both surrealism and ecofeminism are rather different. So I hope it's straightforward, what I'm doing, just the three artists separately. So Carrington's relationship with surrealism was almost the reverse of Colquhoun's, in the sense that she was naturally inducted into it through her partner Max Ernst, and remained close to many of the surrealists without herself very deliberately adopting practices such as automatism. And of course, it's well known that she had a dramatic escape from France after the German occupation, spent months, a little drawing probably from this period in the middle there, spent months locked in a mental hospital, escaped again to New York, where she naturally joined the surrealists in exile there, Breton, Matta, Duchamp, and others. She talked about having a great time with Duchamp on the exhibition First Papers of Surrealism, got bored helping him wind miles of string around the exhibits, and was featured in one of the fake portraits he made for the catalogue, which you see on the left there, which is actually Walker Evans's portrait of the wife of a cotton sharecropper. And that's Leonora. And of course there she is at the centre of a group of surrealists, including Ernst, Duchamp, or not just surrealists, as in Mondrian as well. Her account of Descent into Madness, En Bas, was published in the Surrealist journal, Triple V. In 1943, she moved to Mexico, and there was a little surrealist group there that she was very much part of, with Perret and Remedios, Varo, and Cathy Horner. And this photograph there is of, I think it's actually her wedding to Chiqui Weiss, with Cathy Horner and Remedios and Perret and Gunter Gerzo in it. It was a happy group, and she really enjoyed that. But I'll go back. I'll go back to the beginnings, Carrington's beginnings, and I think it's true to say her position in the context of ecofeminism differs from Colquhoun, as fundamentally, as we saw in her 1970 manifesto, she distances herself from the idea that man is the measure of all things. And it seems to me that that is really what runs right through her work. Other things are actually more important, particularly animals, but the whole of organic life is linked to man is not the supreme rational being he's supposed to be. Man is not the measure of all things. And you remember it said that the last hope is an act of will to step out of the mechanical trap and refuse. If all the women of the world decide to control the population, to refuse war, to refuse discrimination of sex or race, and thus force men to allow life to survive on this planet, that will be a miracle indeed. So organic life, that is everything living from plants to whales to bees to horses, and if necessary humans, is what matters and is under threat. The interconnectedness of the stories and paintings is sometimes obvious, but one should beware of tying them together too closely. It's an interesting topic too. But in one, there's a very definite connection. That is the debutante, which I expect many of you have read. If not, you really should. It's a great story. And it was understandably one of the additions to Breton's anthology of black humour, Anthologie L'Humour Noir, in the re-edition of 1950, very importantly. And I've put a photograph of Ithell, of Leonora as a debutante with her mother, which she was, beside this painting which is very closely related to the essay, the story, the debutante. And The Inn of the Dawn Horse, it's called. Of course, horses are also tremendously important. I mean, the hyena doesn't feature quite so often. But the beginning of the story is as follows. When I was a debutante, I often went to the zoo. The animal I got to know best was a young hyena, Hyène. She knew me too. She was very intelligent. I taught her French, and she, in return, taught me her language. In this way, we passed many pleasant hours. I think that is what this painting shows. They're having a lovely chat to each other, the many pleasant hours. And then, of course, the story goes on. My mother was arranging a ball in my honour on the 1st of May. I've always detested balls. And the hyena says, why, I would love to go. It must be great fun. So they look at each other and they decide that the hyena will dress up as Leonora, because they're almost the same height, apparently. And the hyena said, well, I need a face. So there's a rather grisly episode when Carrington can't quite watch what's happening because the hyena has to kill the maid, Leonora's maid, and eat her, saving only the face. And so Leonora sits reading a story by Jonathan Swift, very important, because Swift, of course, is her model in a sense on this grisly satire idea. So the hyena gets dressed in the ball gown and puts the face on, goes down to the dinner preceding the ball, and of course there's a total disaster because she smells very strong. So the mother comes rushing in and says, what on earth was that creature? It smelt to high heaven. And in the middle of dinner, it got very offended and tore off its face and ate it and jumped out of the window. So that's the story. Okay, so that's one rather extreme example of the stories. But I think on the whole, really, the paintings, the painting and the story, they're not dependent on each other at all. They do different things. I mean, the stories are, they move, they're almost always journeys, that they kind of, they're very unpredictable. Masses is always happening, one after another. So there was an interview, she had an interview with Hans Ulrich Obrist at the time of the exhibition in Dublin a few years ago. And she was asked to explain the relationship between her writing and her painting, writing and painting practices. And she answered, it's always been a puzzle to me. I find it very difficult, but you can tell me. So he persists with the question, no, what is it? She turns it back to him and says, the connection of language to image is very difficult to answer. I've never been able to answer it, so don't look so sad. And she doesn't answer it. But I think the stories are completely unpredictable. They wind and they unwind, with often a journey, animals, humans, and other mythical invented creatures. Like a dream, like a film, things move, metamorphose, retract, and expand. Events are explosive, and there's often a lot of cooking. Paintings, by contrast, necessarily have to contain themselves within a single frame and time frame, and need very definite settings, sometimes architectural, sometimes in nature. And if you look at the way she composes the pictures, they're extremely beautifully done. I mean, it's really, you can't, dissect it down into a story. I particularly love this one called The House Opposite. 1945. It still belongs to West Dean. It was bought immediately by her great patron Edward James, and it's still there. And of course, it is a dream. She's lying in bed in the top right-hand side, and then and then she reappears in green with the rocking horse, and then so the rest of it is very vividly imagined, with these all women or woman creature, woman animal. There's a wonderful cat. I don't know if you can see it on the top left-hand side, with a very characteristic cat-like position, and she loved cats as well. So it's sort of the reality of a dream or a daydream. And there's much more one can say about it, but I think it's one of the great paintings. There's the detail of that. This green tea, I think I won't stop to talk about because it's sorry. But I want you just to notice the kind of predella panel of earth underneath the park, because I'm going to come back to that at the very end. And there's something very odd about that the woman is bound up, and she's standing on a circle as if she's about to be sacrificed. I don't know exactly what it is, why it's called green tea, but you will notice the black and white patterning, which is like that of a Frisian cow. And there's a horse in the exhibition at the moment, and the Palais Luxembourg, which has exactly the same sort of cow-like skin. It's very strange, but I can't explain it. Anyway, remember the predella. And just, I want to talk a bit about the giantess, which is another fabulous painting, 1946. It inhabits all three zones of our world: air, earth, and water. Edward James had commissioned a seascape from her, and she wrote to him to explain what had actually happened. Actually, it's a sort of giantess with a moon-like face in a field of wheat, which is also hair, golden. Her cape is white, and she has a russet red dress with panels in which bird-like people are conversing. Out of the cape come wild geese which encircle her, goose-coloured geese. She is standing against a sort of turquoise sea in which are small islands, a whale hunters which look like Indians, ships and sea. The sky is cloudy and looks as if a storm is working up. Below is a landscape with English-looking bushy trees through which a white female with 4 wings is running very fast, pursued by Great Danes and peasants armed with hay forks, rakes, chairs, etc., etc. All these very small compared with the giantess. She is a sort of portrait of the baby. Leonora just had a baby. So that's strange. It obviously doesn't quite fit, not a whole body. There are also 3 tiny little figures of women between the feet at the bottom. I don't know if you can see those. Shortly after the giantess was painted, Robert Graves published The White Goddess, which built on the 19th century German anthropologist Backhofen's theory of an ancient matriarchy that had preceded the patriarchal orders of European social organization. This book was to have a profound influence on Leonora, whose ideas were already tending the same direction. James hung the painting beside a Jan Bruegel, which is also painted on wood. The giantess is painted on wood, and the Bruegel is also painted on wood. And I'm assuming it was a kind of paradise scene of the type that Leonora loved, filled with birds and horses. And I've also suggested somewhere that one could make a comparison with another giantess, goddess, which Carrington undoubtedly knew in Mexico City, the massive Aztec sculpture of the Coatlicue, the serpent-skirted female goddess. This is a composite with 2 serpent heads forming a single face, eagle feathers and claws, and a necklace of human hearts. But my point would be that it's not a single figure, but an amalgamation of powers that reside in air and earth. And I think she might have enjoyed the parallel with her painting, in which an egg is held at exactly the place of the sculpture's missing heart, because it's been sacrificed. There's a necklace of hands and hearts around the sculpture. Anyway, enough of that one. One of my very favourite paintings called Forbidden Fruit, which is a version of the biblical fall. And Eve is a hairy, upside-down creature, which, as Terry Geiss has written, just passes as a woman. And she's receiving not an apple, but a pomegranate, which is now thought to actually be the apple of the Bible. It's really a pomegranate. She's receiving a pomegranate from a serpent who has lovingly encircled her within a stone enclosure, while baffled bulls look on. And I think it's a unique combination of the erotic, the funny, and the sacred. It's a wonderful painting. I'm just going to leave it on the screen while I very quickly talk about her novel, The Hearing Trumpet, which I very strongly recommend. It is one of the funniest and grimmest novels that I can think of. It's a fable of a world that is ending, prefiguring, it was written in the late 60s, early 60s actually, early 60s, prefiguring her 1970 feminist manifesto. As the Earth closes down, the poles turn and the equator becomes an ice age, and the sun goes out, a group, including several old women, take refuge in a cavern underground. And much happens in the kitchen, and they agree to summon the goddess as a last resort. The air was filled with a humming and a drumming of wings. So I'm quoting the book now. A humming and a drumming of wings, and millions of bumblebees gathered over our heads and formed a great female figure over the boiling cauldron. The swarm shimmered and shook in the formation of the giantess. "Speak, Zampullum," cried Christabel. "Open your heart of wild honey and tell us how to capture your most holy grail, that Earth shall not die on her axis." An army consisting of bees, wolves, 6 old women, a postman, an atom-driven ark, and a werewoman, that is a wolf woman, rescue the holy grail of the goddess. But this doesn't save the human race. And at the end of the book, the old woman narrator comments at the end, "After I die, Anubeth, who was the werewoman, the wolf woman, Anubeth's were cubs will continue the document until the planet is peopled with cats, werewolves, bees, and goats. We all fervently hope this will be an improvement on humanity." And that's the end. So that is a sort of an extreme position, if you like, but I see that. I mean, there's so much more to say about Carrington, but I must, as I promised also to talk about Valentine Penrose quickly, I will go on to Valentine. This was actually a suggestion of yours, Hugo, so I had to blame you for this, all right. Which I always wanted to do. I wanted to work on Valentine, and what I have is very provisional, and it's based on a visit to Farley Farm, where she died in 1978. She was Valentine Penrose because she was married to Roland Penrose, really the leader of the surrealists in England. They got married in 1925. They encountered each other quite by chance. Roland fell immediately in love with her because she's very beautiful, a winged domino. And they moved to Paris, and she basically introduced him to the surrealists because she knew Éluard, she knew Ernst. And then she, basically, they parted. I mean, it didn't work. She preferred women anyway. And that didn't really matter, but she did. And she also didn't like Max Ernst very much. Yes, sorry, I was going to say that, of course, then Roland met and married Lee Miller. And I will just say very quickly a wonderful story of the first meeting between Valentine Penrose and Lee Miller, which is Valentine lived a lot in India. She loved India. She had a sort of spiritual guide in India. She loved the nature there. There's a photograph of her in a minute. And when she heard about the war had broken out, she thought, I must go and fight immediately. So she got a boat from India to sail back to France. By the time it reached France, France had fallen to the Germans. So the boat couldn't land, and it dumped her in London. The only person she knew there, of course, was Roland Penrose. So she called Roland, or somehow got through him, and said, "What shall I do?" And he said, "Oh, come to my house. You know, it's fine. Come to us." And so she got the address, and she set off. I mean, it all happened the same day, apparently, more or less. But she was early, so she went to a pub. It happened that Lee Miller was actually in the pub the same time. And Lee saw this person come in, and she thought to herself, she must be French. She looks so elegant, as in this wonderful photograph. And so she struck up a conversation with her, and they talked very happily without having any idea who each other was. And so when Roland came in to the pub to rescue her. He found them chatting happily to each other, and they remained very, very good friends. In fact, she spent the last years of her life living with Lee and Roland in Farley Farm, which is why I've been able to photograph some of the very rare collages that she made at this time. Now, just to go back to the La Femme Surrealiste, where she is introduced by Bataille, little text right by Bataille. Of course, not at the time, he was already dead, but it was chosen deliberately because, of course, he's well known for his interest in de Sade. And Valentine Penrose's most notorious and popular publication, The Bloody Countess, is a life of the Hungarian Countess Erzsébet Báthory, who murdered girls in order to bathe in their blood. It is one of the most bloodthirsty stories I've ever read, but Valentine tells the life of Esther Báthory. And of course that is what Bataille focuses on in his introduction. It seems out of line somehow with her poetry. It's very curious, but there it is. I can't really explain that at all. So there is a portrait of her based on this photograph by Wolfgang Paalen, who was married to Alice Rahon, who was one of the people with whom Valentine had a very close, loving relationship. This is just, I won't pause on that actually. Valentine was fiercely opposed to anything banal, conventional, or modern. And her poetry is actually, reading her poems, they are very wonderful. They're very spare, and they seem to me somehow like dew, like la rosée. They're very, very precise and immediate of the effect of, you know, a dewdrop on a leaf. And that's the kind of thing that she actually brings to life brilliantly. The collages are really startlingly complex in their making when you're able to see them in the flesh. Like Ernst, she draws on anatomy and natural history publications and revels in the minute lines of the steel engravings. It's very, very similar in some ways to Ernst's collages. But she also intervenes much more on the surfaces of the collages, and it's actually quite, unfortunately, difficult to show it in these photographs too, but she does. In this one, which this is called The Fog, so it was obviously made in London. And she puts a kind of dark wash on the glinting globe on the right. I mean, she's actually painted over it, so it's not just a collage. And this globe seems to harbour very strange sea monsters. And in the collage, La Fin de la Guerre, the end of the war, she's added wash to the rocky cliff above, and she sometimes adds sort of additional, very fine lines to the steel engraving. So they're quite, as well as being actual collages, they're quite heavily worked surfaces, which I think is very interesting. I just thought I'd compare it. The view at the moment is that they are almost like a riposte to Max Ernst, whose collages are so often really focused on violence to women, particularly La Femme Sans Tête. And this is from La Femme Sans Tête. They aren't all, but it strikes me that there's a certain degree of cruelty also in Valentine's collages. So this is Valentine in India, photographed by Roland, talking to a tree. And there's Alice Rahon, at the time they were together in India, also in nature. And the very extraordinary publication of hers called Don des Féminines. I'm not even quite sure how one should or could translate that, Don des Féminines. But it's a book, beautifully produced book, about two women, Maria Elena and Rubia, who you can see together there, one dressed as a male, the other dressed as a female. And it's a story of their life together and their adventures. There's a preface to the Don des Féminines by Picasso, which somehow is very in your face about lesbianism. It's very, but there it is, and it was very much valued by Valentine as that Picasso did the preface to it. So So I'll just go through, just to give you a sense of how the poems work. The quite short poems. I'll just read a couple of them. I dream, youth is beyond the rain, she arrives. But walking the long-drawn embankments, made to fly 100 times in love on skimming water, you shall speak to me. Put back the dream. You wake me, only you. Under the eaves, swallows glitter. And another one. Les cheveux sanglanteront qui avaient lié Rubia. Les baisers s'abattront par lesquels succombait Rubia. La feuille a suivi sa fleur, tandis qu'au ciel se lamente et se destine l'eau, l'heure, la planète et toute chose féminine. I'm going to sign off with something contemporary, completely different. The magazine The Oyster Catcher, that's Huîtrière in French, The Oyster Catcher, I think is a contemporary site where surrealism, the environment, and feminism intersect. And I wanted an editorial in the last issue of The Oyster Catcher last year examined the case of nesting shorebirds in Queens, New York, which attack surveillance police drones, as well as recreational drones, which fly over their beaches, and the birds see them as predators. And so they all leave the nests and go up to attack the drones, leaving the nests open to predators. That's why I put up this little, the predella. It did remind me of Leonora. You can see the bird defending her eggs on the right-hand side. And I'll just very quickly read part of the editorial. Are oyster catchers, that's the bird, the huîtrière, to be portrayed as hysterically misguided culprits attacking life-giving drones? Or are these totemic birds to be recognized as prescient frontline heroes, pushing back against the ongoing catastrophe of surveillance capitalism in a struggle to save not only oyster catcher lives, but our own? I don't know about you, but I'm rooting for the birds. That's it.